coming out and for the work that you do out there, constantly advocating on behalf of our waterways. We're introducing a bill today that's an extension of a bill that we introduced in the last Congress, which was the Stop Harmful Discharges Act. We worked very specifically with Bull Sugar and others to come up with a good piece of legislation that says, let's make human health and human safety the #1 priority as it pertains to managing our waterways. Now, going out and pushing that through Congress, there was a number of entities that had issue with that and saying, listen, there's not a rating system in terms of priorities for how we manage water, recreation, irrigation, navigation, preventing saltwater intrusion, flood control, all of those considerations. And so it would be unfair or unjust to go out there and make this the #1 priority. So we're revisiting this and saying, okay, let's add this to the operational schedule. Human health and human safety as it relates to our waterways here has been said in some different cases that it's part of the consideration, but it's really not, and that's what we're saying. Human health and human safety is given priority as it relates to those communities that are south of Lake Okeechobee and risk of the dike down there breaching and flooding out those communities. That is true, but that is not the same thing as considering the health of people that have to come in contact or wish to come in contact with the waters that are behind us here, especially when we consider that there are discharges. So we're saying that needs to be put into law. That needs to be part of the operational management, especially as there's a serious federal impetus to this. The Corps of Engineers owns what has been done to the Kissimmee, what has been done to Lake Okeechobee, what has been done in creating C-44 and all of these other waterways that exist around here and tributaries. There is absolutely a federal nexus to water quality, and this needs to be written into law. And so what we've gone out there is tried to address those concerns that other folks have and saying, hey, all of these need to be priority. We're happy in adding this to the priority list, but you can't just take the other items that are of consideration and put them further on down the line. So why is this important right now, and what gives us even more opportunity to have success on this front? There's one thing that's occurred that I don't think it's been overlooked, but I don't think it's recognized necessarily how serious it is to have the federal government, the EPA specifically, go out there and say that there will be an 8 parts per billion standard per the EPA that says anything greater than that in terms of microcystin is too toxic for human contact. There was not a federal government scientific standard prior to a couple weeks ago, the EPA coming out and saying that. So when the federal government has come out and said, listen, anything greater than 8 parts per billion microcystin, very toxic for human contact, Alzheimer's, vomiting, nausea, ALS, great number of other things that we probably don't even realize if you come in contact with that. We need to make sure that it gets put into the schedule, it gets put into regulation, that the health and safety of people that come into contact with something greater than 8 parts per billion is taken into consideration. That's what this is all about. EPA coming out with that kind of standard allows us a much greater opportunity to put that sort of thing into regulation. To be specific on it, we actually named it the Protect Florida Act, prioritizing revised operations to eliminate cyanobacteria toxins in Florida Act. That's what Protect stands for. So in that, I just want to say thank you for coming out and hearing a little bit about this. We're going to I know there's a schedule of folks that have to speak, and I'm sorry I don't have the schedule in front of me of the order of it, so maybe everybody else knows what the order is. But that's what this is all about, and then I'll be happy to answer more questions after everybody else speaks, or I'm sure they'll be happy to answer questions as well. But are we going to Jackie first? That's what I'm being told, Jackie first.
Greetings, everyone. Jackie Thurlow-Lippish, South Florida Water Management District Governing Board and former mayor of Sewells Point. I want to thank Congressman Mast for his leadership in protecting our community. Thank you very much.
Who's next?
Hi folks, thanks for coming out today. Alex Gillen, Executive Director, Friends of the Everglades. I'm here today before what is going to be a historic day tomorrow in Florida's water management history when Congressman Mast files the Protect Florida Act. For over 70 years, Florida has been governed by a legal regime that was designed when Florida had 2.5 million people over 70 years ago today. All the members of Congress that were in office have passed. It is long time that we update our operational priorities for the management of our water management system. Senator Bob Graham called for this in 2017 and in 2019 at the Everglades Coalition Conference, and on now 2 occasions, Congressman Mast has answered that call, stepped up and said it's not enough to just spend money at the problem. We also have to adjust the way we manage the problem. It's a two-part problem: operations and infrastructure. And if we don't change the operations, if we don't update our prioritization for human health and safety, then we are not properly addressing the problem. I don't think anybody in Florida or in the United States thinks the government should be in the business of harming or poisoning the people. But when they discharge cyanobacteria water without taking into account the contents of it, like the Army Corps does regularly, that is exactly what is happening. With this bill, the Army Corps will have to manage the lake differently so that we use the existing capacity in the system to send more water south to Florida Bay and Everglades National Park in the dry season, as well as the Caloosahatchee to the maximum extent beneficial, so that we lower the lake, thereby increasing capacity and reducing the likelihood of toxic algae discharges and probably improving the health of the lake too. So I can't understate how important this legislation is to the future of Florida, to the health of Florida, to the economy of Florida, and to the health and safety of our communities. Our kids should not have to grow up in a community where their health is at risk because they want to fish or swim or surf. And so what this bill does is says, enough of that, it's time to move on. And so we thank the Congressman for his leadership, and we look forward to this to becoming law and turning the page on this dark chapter of Florida's history. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Congressman, for your leadership. It's because of our lack of commitment and political will by former elected officials that we're at this place, this 50-plus year problem. This legislation is profound. Like Alex said, it gets to the root of the problem. It puts human health as a priority when it comes to managing our lake's water system. But it's more than human health. It's about economic factors that can happen even faster. It's going to protect and preserve tens of thousands of jobs in the tourism, fishing, and boating industries. And it does it quicker. But almost more importantly, what it does, it preserves a way of life. It preserves the very reason why many of us moved here in the first place. Of course, it's human health, and it gets back to human health. But what this legislation will do, it will put into law and give us the very mechanism to sue the Army Corps of Engineers if they did to us what they did to us last year. When this law is in place, we could sue them for doing what they did to us last year. Right now, Ed Ziak is going to be able to talk to you about what lowering the lake did to this environment, to this area this year. By lowering the lake, you can see, if you take the ride 5 miles out to the St. Lucie Inlet, just to the north on Sailfish Flats, you will see budding, growing seagrasses in clean, clear water. You didn't see that last year. It was that slight operational change that made that possible this year. And this is beyond just here. This is a win-win for the Everglades National Park, for drinking water south of here. If we lower the lake just a little bit by sending water south during the dry season, when the marshes have the capacity to clean the water, it's a win for everyone. This isn't a political issue. We should fight for its passage. This isn't a Democratic, this isn't a Republican, it's not an East Coast, it's not a West Coast, it's not for the South. It's all of us fighting together to make this happen. And it happens with this legislation. We need to give the Corps, the Army Corps of Engineers, the legal responsibility to manage and to change the priorities of our water and managing the water. Thank you, Congressman.
And I'll go to you, Ed. We'll work our way down.
Thank you, Congressman.
Yep.
Very excited about this new legislation. Blair was right. This year we've seen a dramatic difference in the water and a dramatic difference in our business too. And it goes beyond business. Growing up in Martin County, we've spent a lot of time on the water, in the water, near the water, fishing. And it's more than a business for me, it's a lifestyle. And it affects everybody that I know. This year we've seen a lot of cleaner water, a lot more business. I feel safer on the water with my customers today. My boat's right parked back here behind us. My daughter is in the environmental studies wet camp, where she's going to be in the water for the next 2 weeks. If this was last year, I don't know if I would want her in that camp. And it just doesn't seem right to me that my kids should be genuinely concerned for my safety, health and safety on the water every day when I go to work. After 20 years out here, I never thought that I'd be more concerned about my safety, my health, long term, than I would be about just finding fish for my customers to do. So this new legislation has got us all super excited. I'm just one of many guys that make their living out here on this water, and really, really appreciate your efforts, Congressman. Thank you so much.
I'm Christina Maldonado. I've been a veterinarian 25 years, the last 9 of which I've been living here. For years they've been dumping on us. Everybody knows how many gallons and gallons of polluted fresh water come to our estuary. Last summer, when Congressman Mast was trying to get them to lower the lake and they weren't, it was different. 3 months after the discharges started last year, something happened in this town that had never happened before. Dogs became sick. We had at least 6 dogs show up at local veterinary clinics with the exact same symptoms: acute vomiting and liver failure. All 6 dogs had one thing and one thing only in common. They all lived along the St. Lucie River, and they all had either ingested the water or the fish on the riverbank. With extensive critical care costing thousands and thousands of dollars and taking several weeks for all of these dogs, 5 out of 6 of the dogs survived. Toxicology results showed high levels of cyanobacteria in every tissue sample submitted on all the dogs, in their blood, in their urine, in their vomit. Further testing on Finn Adelat, the dog who died, proved that he had died of hemorrhage and organ failure secondary to the cyanobacteria. We were lucky enough to have his brain sample analyzed by the guys out in brain chemistry labs in Wyoming, and it showed that Finn had BMAA, the neurotoxin that is produced by the cyanobacteria, in his brain. Finn lived on that river for 9 years. A lot of us here, standing here and watching this conference, have lived here much, much longer than that. So what does that mean for us? It means that getting rid of these toxins that are coming our way with this passage that this bill that Congressman Mast is trying to pass, is critical, not just for the health of our dogs, for the health of us. They're just canaries in a coal mine. We cannot wait to pass this. It affects all of us. Thank you, Congressman.
On behalf of the City of Stuart, the residents, the visitors, the businesses, the children, I'd just like to say thank you, Congressman Mast, for taking leadership at a federal level to help us. There's only so much we can do here at City Hall, so we're thankful for all of your efforts championing this issue for our safety, for our future.
I'm glad to have all of you to work with. That's true. So again, we'll answer whatever questions you all have, but just to put this into a short perspective on this, there's a couple of things. One, where is there algal blooms right now? There's algal blooms where there's lake water. There's not algal blooms where there's not lake water. That's an important thing to realize as we go through this summer after summer, year after year argument. We don't have algal blooms out there. There's algal blooms on one side of Port Mayaga. There's not algal blooms on the other side of Port Mayaga. That's very specific. The specifics of what the EPA said. Anything greater than 8 parts per billion, very microcystin, very harmful for human contact, leads to a great number of possible diseases and threats to human health. Obviously that leads to a great number of threats for the dolphin that we have out here, the manatee that we have out here, the seagrasses that we need to thrive just to have a good ecosystem out here, and the health of all of our children that are in and out of the water, out on our sandbars, tubing, boating, fishing, being out at camps all summer long. fishing camps, sailing camps, surfing camp, all of the other camps. That's perspective for what's going on here. And right now, it's not into law, and it has never been into law, that our health and our safety and the health of those that receive discharges on the other side of the state of Florida as well, that their health and their safety isn't written into law, that the federal government is going to look after this, knowing that there's a very real problem with the water that they're sending downstream. This is what this is all about changing. Like I said, we've been working on this since the moment we introduced the Stop Harmful Discharges Act. And then when people had issue with that, we've gone through the last year plus working through the issues that people had with that, working with the EPA to say, listen, if we want to move things downstream, we need you to tell us. We need a scientific answer on what is harmful for people. You owe that to the people. EPA finally came out with that, and it's a very big deal for us to move forward with any legislation like this or other legislation relating to our waterways. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer.
You said this is the extension of another bill, previous bill?
It's, you could call it an extension, you could call it a revision. Stop Harmful Discharges Act, which, like I said, that very specifically said human health and safety, #1 priority. Things listed in that schedule of priorities weren't given a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so there were some people that had issue with making that #1, saying, okay, let's add it to the list instead of putting it in a ranked order. These are all things that need to be considered for operational management. Let's touch on that and just say operational management has been successful. It's not the end-all be-all to curing everything that has to do with our water woes, but when the Corps of Engineers works to lower the levels of Lake Okeechobee before we move into what we are looking at right now, how much rain have we had in the last couple of weeks? We know we get into rainy season. We know we get into hurricane season every single year. This isn't a mystery. We know that this is going to happen. When the Corps of Engineers lowers the level of the lake before that, they reduce the risk to the dike, because every inch higher that the water is on the lake, there's more risk to the dike. That's more risk to those communities south of the lake. And when there's risk to those communities, there's risk to our community here, because we have to take the discharges to protect those communities. So we're reducing risk on numerous communities, and that's a good thing. That's what operational management is all about, and this bill forces operational changes.
What do you say to the families who have heard this conversation over and over again, who shoulder that lake? They've heard of the legislative conversation. What relief or solace would you give them?
I would say that this summer is an example of relief or solace that's going on. The governor, the water management district, the change in water management district, what's going on in Washington, D.C., what's going on with operational management with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. These are all changes. Last summer at this time, we were getting discharges. We were getting discharges because at the beginning of hurricane season last summer, Lake Okeechobee was sitting at about 12 foot 10 inches. That same time this year, Lake Okeechobee was sitting right around 11 feet. That difference is the difference of probably, let's say, roughly 170 billion gallons of water on the lake, maybe more, that doesn't need to be discharged. That much more buffer that we have in the system before discharges have to come this way, because the Corps of Engineers says, listen, the lake's at an uncomfortable level. We got to send that water your way. There's a storm on the horizon. We're sorry. We know there's hazards with it, but there's nothing we can do because the dike can breach. That is a change. That's not a change that happened on accident. It's a change that happened because of the push in Washington, the push with the administration, the push with the governor, the push from congressional offices, the push with the South Florida Water Management District to say, you got to take all things into consideration. What's been happening has not been just, it's not been fair, it's not been right, and it's hurting people, and that's how these changes have happened. So it has been a change, and that's the hope that I would give people.
Congressman, talk about the why the clause to allow you guys to sue the Army Corps, and under what circumstances would that happen?
Well, there needs to be liability. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. Why is it that we have a standard of 10 parts per billion for water that goes down south into the Everglades? You know, there was a law that was put in place there, and when there is a threat that, listen, if you don't reach this, there's liability that's associated with that. That's part of the teeth that exists with legislation. So that becomes something that's important to say, we're not just going to put this into place, but we're going to say there's going to be repercussions if this isn't followed, and that's what it's all about. Make sure that there's teeth in the legislation. So I don't know if anybody else has that. Just chime in if you do.
There was a lawsuit filed, I think, last Tuesday along these same lines, saying the Corps had to look at the health and safety over other priorities. I'm assuming you're in support of that lawsuit?
So the Center for Biological Diversity has been working on this, not just this summer, but they've been working on it for a couple of summers now to say, listen, what's going on here with the way that the lake is managed, that it's operated, the level that it's kept at, the evidence that we see going on year after year after year. This is a clear dereliction of duty and protection of the communities, and this has to change, and that's what that lawsuit is all about, and I think it's wholly justified in saying that. Let's look at the facts. 9 of the last 11 years, discharges, massive discharges into the coast. What time of year does that occur? Same time every year, hurricane season. Why does that occur? Because Florida gets a ton of rain. Why does that create this in the system? Because the dike is put at risk because of that. It's not rocket science to say, how do we adjust things to try to at least prevent that? Doesn't mean that we get to be wholly successful in them. We don't know whether God's going to send us no hurricanes or 5 hurricanes this summer. But what we're saying is we're trying to do everything that we can to manage the lake so that we know moving into this season where we're going to get a lot of rain, that we try to prevent those discharges, do everything that we can to prevent them. Why? Because it's causing harm to human beings, to animals, to communities, to everybody around here that comes in contact with it. That's worth fighting.
Okay, the Corps said that this year's a one and off kind of, that bringing it lower down to 11 feet, below 11 feet, it's not going to happen next year, maybe not for another 6, 7 years. What do you think about that? Are they wrong?
So I've had conversation with the Corps to exactly the point that you're making, and some comments being said, this is one-off, it's not going to happen again. That's not wholly true. The Corps is looking at what is going right now. They're not committing to managing the lake again this way next year. That's why we want to work on legislation that demands that they look at operational management, demands that they look at human health and human safety, so that they don't have a choice but to operate differently. This is something that we can see the success of what's going on right now. There were discharges going on this time last year because the lake was kept too high. There are not discharges going on right now because the lake was kept lower. That was a success. There are algal blooms on Lake Okeechobee right now. There are not algal blooms out here right now because we do not have Lake Okeechobee water out here. If that is not taken into consideration by the Corps of Engineers, then they are directly derelict in what they're supposed to be doing, which is managing these waterways and taking health and safety into a priority just as a federal entity. It should be considered. I'm sorry that we have to write it into law to make it that evident and that apparent. But I wouldn't say that the jury is out for them. They're absolutely committed to still looking at it. We want to make sure that they do. We want to make sure they see the successes that are going on right now and repeat those successes next summer.
Last question.
How confident are you How confident are you of this passing? You seemed like last time you were, and it kind of stalled.
Look, so it did stall last time, but it didn't stall without debate. It stalled with people coming and saying, these are the concerns that we have with this. We're willing to work with you on this to get it to a better place where we can offer our support. And that's what this is all about. We introduced it. It brought people to the table. People are saying, let's try to work through this or this or this. We're working through it, and now we're bringing it back after consulting all parties involved. And hopefully they'll go out there and put their stamp of approval on it since we've worked through their issues and help to push other legislators towards working through this. Now, what's one of the big frustrations for me? And I say this very seriously. When I have staff in Washington, D.C., or other representatives in Washington, D.C., or federal agencies that their bigger concern is whether something is convenient for the Corps of Engineers versus whether something is good for health or just basic good governance, which is looking out for the health of human beings. That is a problem that exists in Washington. It's a hurdle that I have to fight to overcome on a daily basis, where people are coming to me and saying, yeah, but how will the Corps of Engineers be able to work through this? I'm not trying to pretend that that's not a challenge, but our biggest concern shouldn't be whether we create challenges for the Corps. It should be whether we make their goals and the things that they have to shoot for right for our environment, right for the people, right for the communities that have to live in around the waters that they manage. And that's not always the attitude in Washington. That's the biggest hurdle that we have in legislation. It's the wrong mentality. In that, hey, anybody have anything else to offer? By all means, there's microphones here if you want. All right. Hey, we'll say thank you to all of you, as always, for paying attention to this issue. We don't get to go out there and move legislation like this without you all paying attention in the way that you do year after year, summer after summer. So thanks to you all as well. Wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for coming over.
Yeah.
Maybe you can get the congressman and his boys out for a little fishing trip on that.
Is this you?
Back there, yeah, good. The doctor with their